Hey everyone, as you can see listed here on this opening slide, this is our first lecture for for English 202, Western Literature and the Arts 2. If that is what you were expecting to see when you clicked on this video, then you are in the right place. I suppose if you somehow clicked on this video and you have no clue what English 202 is, perhaps you need to have a conversation with your advisor. So today, like I said, we're going to launch into the first lecture of the semester. And as such, if you have not yet seen the syllabus review and course introduction video that Professor McIntosh and I did last week, and in the week right before classes, you may have seen some material pop up, or if you didn't join the class until after we submitted those, you may not have seen them. But there's some important information. So if you have not seen that, what I would suggest that you do is pause this video right now, go back to Google Classroom. In Google Classroom, you'll click on the classwork tab. And underneath that, there'll be a tab that says published material. Or I think, yeah, published material. Within that, or maybe published documents, I think it's published material. Within that, you should find the syllabus. You should find a video that we recorded talking about the course and completely filling you in on how this course is going to work and going through the syllabus and explaining things to you. There's some other important stuff that you'll find in that folder that you should at least take a quick glance at before you sit down with me and dive into the material. Right? So again, if you've not viewed that, if you've not read that stuff, I'd pause, go back to Google Classroom and take a look at that, and then come back here. I will wait right here for you. I won't go anywhere, okay? You go ahead and take care of that business. I'll be right here.
We're sorry. All of our representatives are still assisting other customers. Please remain on the line as we value your call.
Okay, oh, hey, are we back? All right, excellent, great. All right, then let's dive right in, shall we? So as it says here, we're going to talk about the late Middle Ages moving into the Renaissance. We are specifically in this class dealing with the history of the art, philosophy, literature, theater, etc. of the Western world. So we're specifically talking about Europe here. Last semester, we ended at the end of the Middle Ages. This semester, we're going to work our way into the Renaissance. But the Renaissance is this period of time that has a wibbly wobbly, tiny, wimey beginning to it. Right? Where there are some who will date the beginning of the Renaissance to the 1400s, like exactly at 1400. Some will date it a little bit earlier. So I'm going to talk about that sort of wishy-washy time period where things are starting to look like the Renaissance, and then we'll move into the Renaissance proper, the beginning of the Renaissance proper. All right, so some of you may have already taken English 201, so this is your second semester, but there are many of you who did not, and that's perfectly okay. You can take these two courses out of order. Right? But the thing that comes with that, with taking this course and not having taken 201, is there's a lot of what I'll be talking about as we dive into the Renaissance that refers back to the material that we were looking at in 201, because the Renaissance is going to be really hung up on looking backward in time and sort of regaining, refreshing, if you will, things that they saw in the past. They thought, yeah, we like what happened back then. So I found this little video that is referred to as history of the art in the history of art in 3 minutes. Now we're not going to watch the full 3 minutes. We're going to watch how this person describes all of that material that you would have gotten back in English 201. All right, this will provide some background for us.
The history of art in 3 minutes.
The oldest art we know of is about 40,000 years old. It was painted on cave walls or sculpted from rocks and consisted mainly of people killing animals or each other. An exception to that rule is the famous Woman from Willendorf, an abstract sculpture of a faceless obese lady wearing no clothes except a shower cap. After a while, people started to write things down, and proper history began. Civilizations developed in Egypt, Persia, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, India, and China. This highly significant period in art history gave the world pots, earthenware, crumbling temples, more pots, gods, warriors, warriors on pots, gods on pots, cats, and god cats on pots. In the Middle Ages, the West was dominated by the Church, who disputed the validity of all the old gods and says there was in fact only one. Art could no longer feature unrealistic things like multi-limbed elephant dancers or winged bearded man-horses, but had to be about things that happened in the Bible. This more realistic, down-to-earth approach gave us morose men in yellow hats, morose men in pink shawls, and lots of glowing babies. Then came the Renaissance and a return to the material world. Real-life places were rendered in 3 dimensions, convincing use of perspective became widespread, and the human body was shown as it really is. Many images, however, remained religious in nature, and so also featured flying men with laser beam eyes, done realistically.
So, of course, that's meant to be humorous, right? But it covers quite a bit of what we talked about in 201. So, let me also just give you a brief, without some of the sort of weird asides and jokiness of what we just saw, a brief summary to get you sort of up to speed. So, of course, in that video, there was a little bit of a talk about prehistoric art. I'm not going to necessarily worry about that here, because certainly prehistoric art was not a concern of people in the Renaissance. All right, so you have the ancient period. This was a period from about 5000 BCE to 500 CE. And when we talk about the ancient period, we talk about a few ancient civilizations that sprung up during that period of time. Ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and ancient Rome. And then in 201, we talked about each of them, and we looked at their cultural significance, as well as their art, their literature, things of that nature. Then, toward the end of last semester, we took a look at what is referred to as the medieval period, or the Middle Ages, which goes from circa 500 CE to, again, circa the 14th century CE. Again, I said somewhere around the 14th century, because it's argued whether or not the Renaissance starts at 1400 exactly, or in the 1300s. Anyway, so when we look at medieval Europe, a few of the important things that we talked about the Holy Roman Empire, which was sort of the vestiges of the Roman Empire that tried to stick around for a while during this period of time, this 1,000 years of history that followed the fall of the Roman Empire. And its significance, that, in this area sort of that we know now as Germany. We talked about its referral as the quote-unquote Dark Ages. It wasn't referred to that in its own time, of course. The Dark Ages as a term really begins to become used in the Renaissance and later, because in the Renaissance, they're going to look back at this 1,000 years of history and then look back at ancient Greece and Rome before them, and they're going to really enjoy what they see that particular period in history doing, its advancements, its art, its culture, and they're going to feel like the medieval period in between was this dark time where we weren't doing the same cool stuff we were doing back in the ancient times. That's how the Renaissance felt about that period of time, at least. And of course, the church, the Catholic Church, was sort of the supreme main governing power of this time. Right? And as such, with the Catholic Church really rising to power and being firmly in place and providing at least a little bit of stability, because that is certainly one thing that the Middle Ages was not particularly known for, was stability. The philosophy of the time in the Middle Ages and everyday life for individuals living in the Middle Ages in Europe was to look toward heavenly rewards rather than an earthly life. The church imposed this way of thinking that while you are on this earth, your main goal is to store up your heavenly rewards. While you are on this earth, you should suffer. You should suffer. You should work hard. You should take on penitent ways of working and thinking as well, because you should be spending your entire life atoning for the death of Christ. You are responsible. Christ died for you. You need to work off that debt, so to speak. And that was the way of thinking, right? That one shouldn't necessarily look toward the betterment of their life here on earth. They should be looking for heavenly rewards. Now, certainly, I don't want anyone to think that applied to everyone. There were certainly wealthy figures in the Middle Ages. There was the royalty. There were the lords and the ladies. There were plenty of people who had wealth and certainly indulged in earthly delights. But that was not the majority by any means. And even if you were a part of that wealthy minority, at the very least, you were trying to justify how your rewards were on earth were at least rewards that had been given to you by God. Right? Whether that be because you inherit that from God, or whether you felt like you had earned it somehow from God. Right? We thought that how also during this time, and again, this is in a lot of ways because of the prevalence of the church, a lot of the ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, literature, art, and science was actively repressed by the church, particularly in Western Europe. Now, there were some people who continue to sort of copy those things down and sort of keep them hidden on the down low, and which is why we have some of that that has survived. A lot of the writings of the ancient Greeks and Romans also survived in the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine Empire was what was left of the Roman Empire in Eastern Europe and into like Eurasia. The Muslim Empire as well hung on to and preserved a lot of the ancient Greek and Roman writings. But in the West, in Europe, a lot of that was actively repressed. And so a lot of the advancements of the Roman Empire were lost. A lot of the ideas of the ancient Roman Empire and ancient Greek empires were lost. Right? And so a lot of people didn't know a huge amount about what had come before the Renaissance, or before the Middle Ages. Then we get into the Renaissance. We're talking the 15th into the 17th century. It's about a couple hundred-year period where the Renaissance is, as a term, literally means rebirth. It was this period of a renewed interest in the ideas and art and science of the ancients, particularly of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. They wouldn't particularly be looking back at ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia. This renewed interest was looking back at that period of time, and there was a nostalgia for it. It felt like this was this period of time when we had had great advancements in architecture, in civic engineering. Some of the philosophies of ancient Rome and ancient Greece began to be available again. People started reading this stuff and seeing these ideas that were not necessarily immediately connected to Christianity. These ancient Greeks and ancient Romans wouldn't have had access to the ideas of Christianity anyway. But finding that they liked them, and there were these good, solid ideas that were solidly European that we had gotten away from. That's the way they would have felt looking at those. And so they wanted to look back at what they saw as a purer, stronger period in history and bring some of that back. And so in the Renaissance, in Europe, humanism becomes prevalent. Now, humanism, I'll define much more in depth in a later lecture. I can't remember if that's in this lecture or in part 2. I think it may be in part 2. But humanism essentially is the opposite, if you will, of the medieval way of thinking about life. Humanism essentially stops thinking about the world in terms of God is this great and holy and perfect thing on high, and we humans are the lowest of the low. We are scum, and we deserve all the horrible punishments that God may inflict upon us. Humanism starts to say just the opposite. Humanism looks back at ancient Greek ideas that human beings were the closest thing to a perfect creation on this earth by the gods. And ergo, as such, we were the closest thing on earth to God. We were godly in that way. Suddenly, in the Renaissance, you start having people who are reading that stuff, and they say, wait a minute, God created us in his image. That means we are the closest thing to God on this earth. Actually, we're pretty freaking awesome. We're not these lowly creatures that need to atone for all of our sins. We're capable of great things. And we should focus on that while we're here. We shouldn't constantly spend all of our time worrying about what's going to happen to us after we die. While we're here, let's take advantage of this near perfect creation that God has made us, and let's make some stuff happen. Right? Let's get it while we're here, kind of thing. And there's also this return to science and philosophy, again coming out of the ancient Greek and Roman rediscoveries, if you will. And in this period of time, there is some big religious upheaval. The church itself is going to begin to lose a bit of its power. The Catholic Church is going to lose a bit of its power during this time period. There's going to be the Protestant Reformation that will arise in Europe and sort of try to challenge the church's position. There will be a move towards secularization in some cases, and that religious upheaval in Europe takes place over this 200 years, and we're kind of still recovering from it to this day. Now, so that you get sort of an idea of the instability of the Middle Ages. Because one could argue that the things that are going to happen in the Renaissance just could not happen in Middle Ages, because in the Middle Ages, everything was just constantly in flux. So over here on the left, we have a map of Europe from, it says 1200 up here. And you can see the continent is divided up into some pretty large chunks. There's not much here that looks the way that the map looks now of Europe. Right? We still have the Holy Roman Empire, right? And what is most of what was the Holy Roman Empire is now Germany. Some other bits of like the Netherlands and France and over into some of these Eastern European countries here were included in this. But this is what's left of the Roman Empire. This and this little area down here known as the Papal States. This is where Rome itself would have been, and would have had Vatican. The Vatican City would be here. So this is a place that is extremely controlled by the church. Right? France is not quite what we expect it to look like yet. England hasn't yet conquered. Scotland hasn't yet conquered all of Ireland. And we see all this breakup, and even what was left of, it says the Roman Empire here, but this would have been Byzantine. You see Byzantine, if you were, if you have taken 201, you remember the Byzantine Empire, Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire was much larger than this. It's now getting squeezed down to this little bit. But still, wait, this is in 1200. Jump ahead to 1300, let me move myself over a bit. Right, 1300 over here, so just 100 years. Now, 100 years may feel like a long time to you, but in the course of history, it's just a blip in time. Over the course of 100 years, look at just how fractured this all became. Right? France still looking pretty similar to it. England's still looking pretty similar. But look, the Holy Roman Empire has been broken up. The Italian peninsula has been broken up into all these little things. The little bit that was left of Byzantium is now even further reduced in size. This is an indication of the kind of political upheaval that's happening as people and smaller kingdoms vie for their own provinces and things of that nature. And so the church, right, had a much easier time controlling these larger areas. But once you start breaking everything up and everything becomes so much smaller, there's so much more. Now it is becoming much more cultural diversity. It kind of makes sense that things happen the way that they do, and that the church begins to lose some of that control, that is. Now, as we arrive at the end of the Middle Ages and moving into the beginning of the Renaissance, let's take a look specifically at the Italian peninsula for a bit, because what's going on here is going to be of great importance in the Renaissance. The Italian peninsula, as we reach this period in time, is starting to get broken up into a grouping of what are called city-states. These city-states formed as urban areas around Italy became independently wealthy apart from the church. Understand that right there is going to be a refrain that's going to be repeated often over the next few lectures. Because each time a region becomes independently wealthy from the church, and then they no longer feel like they owe their fidelity to the church, the Renaissance begins to arrive. It's a marker that the Renaissance is, if not arriving, it's on its way. This would usually be due to commerce in the area or some natural resource. And then these cities would gain control of the surrounding areas, and now you have what is referred to as a city-state. That city-state could now take part in civic pride, and start investigating secular and religious pursuits as well. Now, civic pride, secular religious pursuits. First off, let's talk about, if you recall, if you've taken English 201, if you haven't, I'll remind you, that in ancient Greece, city-states were a thing. You have a city and a surrounding province, sort of named after that city. Like Athens. Athens was a city-state. Sparta was a city-state. Right? So this is already an idea that's being borrowed from the ancients and being brought back again. Right? Civic pride. Suddenly now, if we have these different cities around the peninsula of Italy, and this would happen in other places in Europe as well, we can now start to take some pride in our own city. That would not have necessarily been allowed before, right? We should be thinking of ourselves as these lowly creatures here on Earth. But now we can say, no, you know what? Our city is not only a great city, it's the best city. Our city is red hot, your city ain't doodly squat kind of thing, right? We can have that kind of pride in who we are as a city. So you get some important city-states that crop up during this time, like Siena, Florence, the Papal States, of course, right? The Papal States, these right here that are in this kind of yellowy cream kind of color, Papal States are still powerful. Don't get me wrong. That's where the church is centered and headquartered, and it's going to remain powerful, but not as powerful as it was in the Middle Ages. Venice as well. Venice is up here. Naples, this area down in here. These all become very important city-states, and each one, the people within that city-state can now feel a sense of pride, and they do. They start to express a sense of civic pride in who and what we are as Florentines, or who and what we are as Venetians, right? As Sienese, right? We can begin to take some pride in that, and we want to start attracting the best of the best to our city-state to make it even greater. This leads us into a period of time that gets referred to as the Proto-Renaissance. Now, when I was a student a number of years ago that we will not talk about, in a similar position as you, the Proto-Renaissance wasn't really talked about as much. This period was sort of referred to just as sort of the late Middle Ages, but there have been those who have sort of re-examined it and have said this needs its own classification. And they say that this is essentially a pre-Renaissance period of time from roughly the 14th century, from 1300 to 1400, specifically in Italy, and it refers to, the Proto-Renaissance refers to specifically the progressive artists, the painters, and eventually some sculptors, though we're going to look specifically at painters, who pioneered a new form of figurative naturalism. Figurative just means we're painting things that are meant to look realistic. Right? We're painting things. Figurative means people, places, things, animals, right? Identifiable stuff that you can point at and say, yep, that's a barn, that's my Aunt Tilly, this is a dog, that's a pond, that's a tree. Right? Naturalism means that those things are made to look as close to observational, natural as possible. Right? Observational naturalism means that you're trying to make these look as close to what our eyes see as possible. And these artists that we're going to look at start doing that here in this period known as the Proto-Renaissance, but what they were pioneering wouldn't be fully developed until we get into the Renaissance proper. So our first artist that we'll look at from this Proto-Renaissance period, and an extremely important one, you'll probably see a quiz question about this individual, Giotto di Bondone, or you can just refer to him as Giotto. A lot of the artists that we're going to look at would just go by their first name. Giotto, that's what we knew. Giotto is Giotto. Giotto di Bondone, he was born somewhere around 1267. He died in 1337. And he was a 13th and 14th century Italian painter and architect from Florence, who is considered a pioneer of what, as we said, has since been labeled the Proto-Renaissance. Again, like I just said, it's sort of a bridge period of time between medieval and Renaissance. Now, Giotto arrives on the scene, and he's going to be doing some stuff that's going to blow people's mind in his time period. Now, up until Giotto arrives on the scene, a lot of the paintings that would have been done at the time would have been very Byzantine in nature. And to a certain extent, Giotto is still looking at the old Byzantine paintings. They were all very flat. Before we really sort of dive in looking into this work of his, let me look just real quickly at some of Giotto's influences. So Giotto starts traveling around, and he's looking at things like the very early Christian frescoes, right? So a fresco, what is a fresco? Fresco is a painting that is done, usually on a wall, it's usually a mural, where wet plaster is put onto a portion of the wall, and an artist paints into that area as quickly as they can as the plaster is curing. And then they'll plaster another area and paint there, right? So that once the plaster has cured, that paint has cured into it as well. Down in the catacombs underneath Rome and in other places in what was the former Roman Empire, there were these early Christian frescoes that were painted on the walls as murals. He's looking at those. He's going down and checking with those. He's also looking at Byzantine art. And he's looking at these icons that were being painted in the Byzantine world, in the old vestiges of the Roman Empire that were Orthodox Christianity reigned supreme in that area. Again, Turkey, what had once been Greece, or ancient Greece, and Eurasia, that area. Where there was this sort of approach, the very generic faces, very flat depictions of people, places. Well, I say places. Oftentimes you'll see the places aren't even there, right? Like it's just people on a flat background. Everything is very flat. There's sort of an elongated nature to things. If you look at like fingers often look elongated. Faces feel a little bit stretched, right? But there's a flatness to it all. And as I said, faces are often very generic. Right? And there's things like the insistence upon gold. There are the halos around the heads of anyone who is an important, holy person, right? Someone from Scripture often. And yes, the Roman Empire had fallen, but those ancient sculptures were still around. I mean, a lot of those old ancient sculptures are still there today. So Giotto's living in Italy. He can wander out and take a look at all of these sculptures that are all over the place. And he starts to study them. And he's interested in a few things. He likes the naturalism of ancient Roman sculpture, right? How much those ancient Roman sculptors were trying to create something that looked realistic to our eyes. Naturalistic realism. That's what he's. That's what I was talking about earlier when I said figurative naturalism. That's one thing he likes. But he's also thinking, because he wants to do that in paint. How do I do that in paint? How do I make the surface of what I paint feel like it has depth? How do I make someone understand that this person that I am painting is not a flat image, but is rather something that has depth to it? That you could step into this world, you could reach around these people. How do I do that? And he starts noticing the ways in which light and shadow interact on these old sculptures. And he's like, okay, all right, yeah. Like, so there's a really strong, we'll call it a plane of light right here. And that's contrasted with a darker shadow right there. And you can see when the light is just right, those contrasts are very stark and very sharp. And so he starts thinking about that. And so when he then, there we go. So then he then begins to apply some of those influences to his paintings. As I said, he's going to do some things that are going to blow people's minds at the time. So with those influences in place, with he's starting to combine these ideas while bringing in a little bit of humanism. He produces something like this piece right here. This is one of his most famous paintings, The Lamentation, painted somewhere around 1305. And in The Lamentation, which is a fresco, it is a fresco. In fact, the centuries since it was created have revealed some of the places where he put down plaster and then painted. So the reason you see like these cracks in places here is because as he was working on this, these would have been places where he put down plaster and he painted. And then over the years, the cracks in between those areas of plaster have shown themselves. All right. So what do we see him doing? Again, the fresco. That's an idea he's pulling from the old ancient Roman catacombs, those early Christian frescoes. And we see certain things that he has inherited from the Byzantine Empire. There are those gold halos around the head of everyone that is an important figure, whether that be the angels in the sky, whether that be Jesus, Mary, John, Peter. Right? These are all important people, so they get their golden halos, right? But there's more happening here. And when I tell you that this painting and others like it at the time that Giotto comes along, when I tell you that this to them was the equivalent of the first time anyone ever watched, like, I don't know, an IMAX 3D movie, and was just like blown away at how certain things feel like they're super close to your face, and certain things feel like they're hundreds, if not thousands of feet away, and you feel the movement, and like that kind of thing. If you've ever had the privilege of seeing a 3D IMAX movie, this felt like that to a lot of the people looking at these paintings. And why? Well, because suddenly, though to your eyes and mine, this may not feel super close to nice, perfect, naturalistic realism just yet, right? These people don't look necessarily like we are looking at them out in the world with our own eyes. We're going to get to some artists who are going to get there. Boy, will they get there, right? That's not happening yet to our eyes, but to the people of the Proto-Renaissance looking at this, some new things are happening. What is he doing? Well, he's taking those lessons that he got from looking at the old Roman sculpture that he sees around. And you see his use of light and shadow mimicking what he sees happening in those old sculptures. Right? That harsh light, sharp contrast between the light and shadow, dividing the body up into sort of a series of planes. And then those planes give us the sense of that human being a solid three-dimensional thing that's in front of us. Right? Now, they end up looking very blocky as a result to our eyes, but it works, right? We get this indication, like nobody feels flat. No one has the kind of flatness of the old Byzantine era. Also, a thing that the Byzantine era would do is, again, because of the flatness of everything, is there would be no depth. And so oftentimes, it's happening a little bit in this piece. I probably should have gotten one more piece to showcase this happening. But people, what would either be sort of side by side, or if there needed to be any kind of distance shown, you'd have one person just sort of stacked on top of another, right? In complete flatness. There was no sort of sense that there was depth happening there. Not with Giotto. Giotto gives us a scene where the people within it aren't just perfectly arranged so that we can see them all, right? People block our view. This woman is blocking our view of whoever that is behind her. Her hand has come up and has completely blocked the face of this person here. We have Mary and Jesus who are blocking our view of who's behind them. And we even have this woman right here in front who's blocking our view of Jesus. And not only is she doing that, but the way he painted her with this blocky kind of light and shadow, she's protruding a little bit into our space. She's blocking our view, and she feels like she's slightly in our space. That is characteristic of Giotto. You're going to see that kind of thing happen in a lot of his pieces. And then he wants to give us a sense of depth. He wants this entire thing to feel, and understand, this is again painted on a wall, so it's really large. And he wants you to be standing in front of it and feel as though it's happening in front of you, and that if you only somehow could magically step to the wall, you could step right into this thing. And so he often has the action that we see happening on what feels like a very shallow stage. Right? You'll notice, like, it feels like there's a nice flat floor in front of us, and this bit of rock that sort of comes down here doesn't feel like it's that far away, right? It's kind of like a shallow stage, as if we were watching something happening on a stage in a play. Now, that was already mind-blowing in and of itself. Right? The sense of three dimensions, the sense that objects and people and environments have depth and space, and that we could step into that. That was already mind-blowing in and of itself, and it did blow minds. But he's also bringing into this that sense of humanism that I was talking about. Now, it's a religious painting, for sure, no doubt about it. This is, the Lamentation is a traditional scene that gets painted. It's meant to be the moment right after Christ has been taken off of the cross, and the people around him who lament, who cry and mourn Jesus' loss. And in this painting of the Lamentation, in a lot of medieval and Byzantine versions of this scene, everyone has that same stoic, generic face. Does Giotto do that? No, he does not. Not only do we get the indication that each person here is an individual, we also get an indication that, there's evidence here. He may have even had models, right? This guy looks very specific, in such a way that it looks like Giotto may have found a guy and he was like, you know what, I want you to be St. Peter. Come and sit for me. Let me sketch you out. Let me get an idea of how your face looks. I want to include you in this. Right? Everybody looks very individualized. Right? Let's go back to the Byzantine, and medieval art was very much like this as well. Right? Faces are super generic. They have rules that you follow in order to create them. And often, like I said, they're expressionless. He's not doing that here. He has used specific individuals. He wants each person to look different than the next person. And he has gone through great pains to showcase their emotions. That's not a thing that would have been allowed or even really thought about in the Middle Ages. Again, because it's not how human beings were thought about. We were meant to be lowly and strive toward the perfection of God, but that's a reward for later. Giotto is telling us a story of a biblical event, and he is allowing the people within it to have emotions. Not only the people within it down here, who are, of course, humans with their feet planted to the ground, even the angels themselves are wailing and crying over this incident that's happened before them, Christ's death. That's an early example of humanism, because Giotto is using an emotion that we as human beings can all identify with, that pain, that anguish, that sadness, and allow that to see those looks on their faces, to be a moment we can sympathize with the people that we're seeing, and we can maybe get a little bit of a feeling in ourselves of what that might have been like, what it might have been like to have been there in that moment. And that's early humanism, not at all like what would have been seen in the Middle Ages. And that blew people's minds. Now, he wasn't above making paintings that were still hanging on a little bit to the old medieval ways of thinking. He had, of course, patrons who would have been paying him, different churches, chapels, things of that nature. He's not getting a ton of, say, private patronage. He's painting for the church. And they would have still had some expectations that things looked the way they've always looked in the Middle Ages. This painting that he did in 1305 to 1306, a Madonna enthroned, is an example of him hanging on to some of the old medieval ways of doing things, right? This looks very Byzantine. With all that gold, the people are kind of stacked up, but there's still that classic Giotto treatment of the forms of the figures, these sharp, very blocky, almost planar figures that are within the scene. And again, he may have stacked these people a little bit, but their halos are blocking our views of others behind them. And he doesn't quite have how perspective works yet. We'll see that someone else is going to figure that out soon. I say soon, in another 100 years or so. But he's done a little bit of work here to give an indication of the depth of the throne that she's sitting on and the steps. And that, again, if we had been standing in front of this, it's meant to look as though we could step in. We could just take a step, and then we could take another step, and then we'd be right there at the foot of the Madonna. Now, baby Jesus here looks like, like a 43-year-old man, but that was also very medieval. A lot of medieval paintings of Christ, and certainly paintings of Christ in the Byzantine Empire, often have baby Jesus looking like a grown man. It was a thing. And so he's not quite getting away from that, but you get a sense of naturalism in the way that he is painting all the other figures, including Mary herself, where he seems to have models that he is basing these on. Now, we jump from Giotto. Giotto starts doing his thing, and I often refer to him as sort of the iPhone of Renaissance art, right? Some of you may not remember just what a mind-blowing thing it was when the iPhone came out. So before the iPhone, of course, we had cell phones, but a cell phone, you could make calls on it. You could call someone. You could maybe text someone. Some phones couldn't even do that. And you had this keypad, right? That was only numbers. So in order to get the letter you want, you had to hit a certain number on your number pad a certain number of times to get the particular letter you wanted. So texting would take forever. Maybe you were lucky enough that your phone had a small LED screen, and that LED screen would allow you to play games, right? That often you didn't download from the internet. Maybe if you were lucky, your phone provider would allow for certain games to be downloaded by data transfer, or oftentimes you might download the game on your computer and then transfer it to the phone. And then the iPhones came out and could do all these amazing, crazy things that they could do. And I mean, to this day, that was 2007 when the iPhone came out. To this day, I've essentially got an iPhone, and this is not an iPhone. This is, this was a Samsung phone here. But essentially, I have another iteration of what the iPhone was, with its screen, with the apps, with the icons on there. It operates in the same way. It's got the camera on it, right? It's essentially what an iPhone was. And that was because everybody's mind was blown by the iPhone, and everyone said, oh, crap, we got to catch up. Apple is leaving us behind. They are doing stuff that we weren't even thinking about doing yet. Giotto is that. Giotto comes along, he's doing what he was doing, and other artists say, whoa, okay, we need to kick our asses in gear because we got to catch up with what this guy is doing. So then we come to the 14th, in the 14th century, in the Republic of Siena, right there. So very close to Florence, which is also going to become very important at this time, around about this time. And in the Republic of Siena, it's this powerful city-state that has, in the 14th century, become wealthy apart from the church. Rinse and repeat. You're going to hear that a lot. This was due in large part to bankers and merchants who were investing their money in overseas trade. So individuals are starting to make money, right? Whereas in the Middle Ages, who had money? People who held land, kings, queens, the royalty, the lords and ladies who held the land, and the church. The church who could tell people who could have wealth and who could not. Now you have enterprising individuals, bankers, merchants, people who are building ships, who are investing in trade with other city-states, other countries, other parts of the world, other continents. And these are individuals who are doing their own thing. The city-state becomes wealthy as a result of their efforts, and it has nothing to do with the church. This meant that there were large reserves, large sums of monetary reserves that could be then used for things like commissioning artwork. So a weird thing happened, and I'm letting this play so that you can see. I was hearing what I hoped I was hearing was just rain on the roof, but I was also kind of worried that I was hearing a strange sound in another room. And so you saw I paused my video. I went and checked on it. When I came back to try to begin recording my lecture again, I want you to notice what's going to happen here. Yeah, that's right. The entire rest of my lecture recorded absolutely no sound whatsoever. I think I know what happened. I pulled the microphone out of my laptop, pulled the connector out of the laptop to walk away and go check on things. When I came back and plugged it back in, I guess my recording software just didn't recognize that I had plugged it back in. Well, at this point, it's late. I am so tired, and I don't feel like trying to record this entire last bit of the lecture again. I normally like to record these lectures new for each semester. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to an old lecture from a year ago and just grab the portion that would have made up what was remaining in this lecture, and I'm going to tag it on here. So you're going to see the 1 year younger version of myself. The audio quality might not be quite as good. I don't remember for sure. But anyway, my apologies. This is not how I like to do things. Thank you for your patience. And so in the midst of all of this, there start to be suddenly these large civic monetary reserves, meaning that the city had a lot of money that it was sort of hanging on to. And with that, they decide, like, again, civic pride. Siena is the greatest city, so we need to get the greatest of the great in here. So they start commissioning artwork. Amongst the artists who come out, what's going to become the Siena tradition, are Duccio, whose last name I'm going to try to pronounce right now because I'm too tired and my brain won't let me get there right now. Duccio and his students and his students and his apprentices emerge at this moment, creating innovative works of art that allude to the coming Renaissance. Similarly to what's happening with Giotto, because Duccio clearly has looked at Giotto, and he sort of begins working in new, innovative ways in Siena and passing that along to his students and apprentices. So Duccio, born in 1255, died in 1319. Even though he is a little older than Giotto, he sort of arrives at working in this very naturalistic manner later than Giotto. So he's an Italian painter, active in Siena in the late 13th and 14th century during the Proto-Renaissance again. And he painted several important works in government buildings and churches and cathedrals. Now, again, that wasn't a thing that you would have seen in the Middle Ages for the most part. Artists didn't really spend a whole lot of time going into those areas painting projects that were meant for the people, right? If somebody painted for royalty, well, what they painted was meant for the royalty, right? The people weren't going to see that. Church commissions are what artists' main bread and butter had been. Now suddenly there are government buildings because the governments of a lot of these city-states are republics and or are democratic in some fashion. And those government buildings start also hiring artists because they really want to show off the greatness of their city-state. He's credited with creating what is referred to as the Sienese school of art, which isn't literally a school. It just means, in this case, school is just another word for style. He develops the Sienese style, which took Byzantine formality, right, the stern formality of Byzantine art, and the new naturalism that's coming from Giotto, right? This idea that you should observe with your eyes and try to capture what your eyes are seeing. Paint that's naturalism. And combining all those two things and folding them in by taking religious subjects and humanizing them. We saw Giotto doing a little bit of that. Duccio and his students will as well. So there's this piece, the Maestà. This is a giant altarpiece that he painted 1308, 1311. An altarpiece would be a piece that would be on the altar in a church, and it would be behind the altar so that mass would be performed in front of it. It essentially provided a backdrop. And in the cathedral in Siena, parishioners would be on all sides of the altar, so it was painted front and back. Over here, where we see Mary enthroned on the left, that's the front of this. Over here, we have the right. Mary was the patron saint of Siena, since it was believed that she had helped them to defeat Florence in a battle that they had back in 1260. But when Duccio painted this, civic pride was so elevated in Siena, and Duccio's mastery of painting at this point in time was considered so synonymous with what people saw as the success of Siena, that this particular piece was paraded from his studio through the streets of Siena, through the town center, to the cathedral, marched along for everyone in Siena to see. And Duccio was allowed to sign his name down here at the foot of Mary, which is a very new idea, right? That's something that wouldn't have been allowed for most of the Middle Ages. So at Mary's footstool there, we have his signature. The 7-foot tall central panel, this right here is 7 feet. So imagine just how huge this whole thing is. That depicts the Virgin and Child enthroned, and she's surrounded by angels and other important saints, both biblical and saints that had been canonized by the Catholic Church after the biblical times. And then on the back, over here, we have several smaller panels that depict stories from the life of Christ. And actually on the front and back, right? Down here we have some as well. These are stories from the life of Christ. And again, this kind of... this painted front and back because in that particular cathedral, parishioners could see the back of it as well. Here's that central panel with Mary in the middle. And if you've paid any attention at all over the past couple of weeks, you can see that is extremely Byzantine, right? He has studied what's happening in the Byzantine Empire and is incorporating it into his work. We have that austere formal composition, right? Everything is very stiff and sturdy. And there's even a certain amount of symmetry. It's not perfect symmetry, right? But if we draw a line down the middle here of Mary, if we see something on one side, it's echoed on the other side. If it's a person, right, well, there's going to be a person, maybe not the same person, but a person in the exact same position on the other side, right? Everything's symmetrical and very sturdy and very formal, right? Very Byzantine in that way. Right? Even the saints up here, they're mirroring one another. The figures and faces of the saints and the angels are still very influenced by Byzantine conventions, right? Like you look at these angels and you see the Byzantine generic face, right? All over. And down here, right, these are the four saints that are kneeling at her footstool here. There, however, we start to see some evidence of individualized observation. Right? Like it seems like for this guy, these two over here, and some of the other people who are depicted here, there's evidence of, again, Duccio having picked out models and trying to make this character in his painting look like what he is observing while looking at someone that he's using as his model. That's very different from what the Byzantine era gave us, and he also with the four of them breaks from the stiffness of Byzantine poses as well, right? They feel much more natural and relaxed while they're kneeled down in this way. He's also fascinated with portraying fabrics, similarly to how Giotto was. But in his particular case, he's obsessed with getting the thin wispiness of fabric, right? And capturing that, and capturing the textures, the different textures of fabric, whether fabric is really thin and muslin-like, or whether it might be more velvety in texture. And like, Giotto wasn't interested in that. Giotto was just thinking about sort of the planes of light and shadow that he needed. Right? That was pretty much kind of it. Right. In these particular cases, it feels softer, and it's not that sculptural approach to painting that Giotto had. Still, Duccio he's holding back here, right? This is the front. This is going to be, he knows his customers, and he knows his customers are still, stuck in the Middle Ages way of thinking about things. So he doesn't want to break from his austerity too much here. He doesn't want to get too experimental. On the back, he got much more experimental. This is one of the panels, the portrayal of Jesus that was painted in 1308 to 1311. We have some inventive storytelling here, right? Where we have Judas kissing Christ here, very central in the piece, right? Then over here, he has this way of storytelling where all of the elements of the story are kind of like happening simultaneously, right? So that we've got, like I said, Christ being kissed by Judas in the middle, Peter over here cutting off the ear, which would have happened after this, and then over here these apostles who are running away. It's all in one panel. And now in his case, the background is still very flat and very Byzantine, right? I can move this. This doesn't quite feel like what Giotto was giving us, right? This doesn't feel like a shallow stage. It feels like a backdrop, and notice how the people their feet just sort of feel almost like they're floating there. This doesn't feel like it has that depth to it that Giotto gave us, right? So he's still hanging on to that a bit, but his way of telling the story with these people is not stiff. Right? The figures are dynamic, not stiff at all. They move, they flow. Where these apostles are running away, we even get a sense of the the drama as their clothing swoops as they turn to run away. Right? There's a sense of motion that we don't really see in very much artwork in the Middle Ages. We get the sense of observation, right? It feels like there's been a different model brought in for each of the characters. He's used someone and has painted these faces from observation, as well as the clothing. It looks like it's convincingly draped over a body that's underneath the clothing. Giotto was less concerned with that, right? Giotto was just looking at the light and the shadow, right, and thinking about how things. He's approaching the painting as if it were a sculpture. Duccio is thinking about there's the clothing, there are all the wrinkles, but there's also a body underneath that fabric, and that fabric should be falling over the body. And so, what does that look like, and how do I portray that? He's even got different skin tones on different people, so he's even thinking about that with this. Emotions are shown on faces, postures and gestures are used to tell the story and display a variety of different types of emotions, the way people are standing, the way their faces are, again, the running away of this group over here to the right. It's a theatrical approach to storytelling in painting that is a decisive step toward humanism in painting.